just record the music. That's all you have to do. Just come into the studio, sit down, play the guitar, and sing the songs. And that's all you have to do. And that was probably the best advice about recording music. Hi, I'm William John Titus Bishop. Well, I am the creator of a lot of music. My latest album is called Americana. It's available now as a kind of exploration of American folk music. I am on all of the usual social media platforms. So you can find me on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, and there are some music videos there. And also my website, which has a lot more information. There's a store on there. If you want to pick up some merchandise, you can do that as well. And that's www.williamjohntitusbishop.com. And you're watching and listening to Two Geeks Talking.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. Two Geeks Talking is an entertainment industry interview show where we interview the creative people from the comics, TV, film, music, and video game industries. I'm your host, Kurt Sesso. We are joined today by a multi-talented musician. He's a writer. He's a creator of some amazing music that I happen to hear on Spotify. Over 1 million followers on various social media platforms, including Instagram. But that's not why he's here today because of his follower count. We're here to talk about his music. We're joined by the ever-talented William John Titus Bishop, a very talented musician. How are you doing today?
I'm very well, thank you. Firstly, I'd like to say thank you for having me on today. I've listened to a few of your previous episodes, and they really are very, very entertaining. So thank you again for having me.
I appreciate that. I always love someone, a guest that comes on that listens to past interviews. It makes things so much easier on my end here. For those that don't know anything about yourself as a creative person, tell us who you are and what you're bringing to Two Geeks Talking today.
Okay. I am, primarily a recording artist and a performing artist. And I write and compose music in various genres, but currently in the sort of indie pop, folk pop area.
I only play clarinet when I was in high school, so I don't have a very wide range when it comes to a creation of music here. So I always love talking to musicians like yourself to understand the theory behind music, the theory behind the creation of your songs, your process as well is rather interesting. I always find that amazing. I mean, I definitely want to dive into those topics here. But what is the most misunderstood concept about being a musician that people who don't follow the industry misunderstand?
That's a great question. I think the music industry is such a broad term, and it covers so many different areas that it can be difficult sometimes for people who aren't working in or with music to understand exactly where the musician fits into that. For me, I'm sure it's different for every musician, but for me, basically, I write songs and I write lyrics and I work with other musicians and producers and sound engineers to create a piece of music, an album or a single, or a music video. And then that goes off to a distributor or record label. And then they tend to take care of the commercial side of things. I'm quite fortunate in that I can spend quite a lot of time working on the creative side. So that really, in a nutshell, is where I fit into that. It is very much on a creative side and just giving some creative input to something and then giving that to a label, and then they can make that into a commercial product. But that's something that I wouldn't want to do myself. That's something I don't have any sort of knowledge of or any sort of experience in that side of the industry. There are some very good people who do a very good job of that.
Our strong suits are what we enjoy doing. It's what we're passionate about. It's what we're creative in. I think that's a first step in being a creative person. Being a musician, though, you have to have a creative process in terms of putting down your music from mind to paper to production. What is your creative process when it comes to writing and composing music?
When I have the concept of an album, I like to get that out very quickly. By that I mean I will take a pad of paper and a pen and sit down and write 10 songs. That normally takes about a day. And then I will write very basic structures for those songs just on piano or guitar. And so there's a very basic outline of those songs. And then I would take that to a recording studio with some other musicians, the technical staff there, producers, mixing engineers, and then we will work together on the songs and record those sort of as a group. But so that really is the whole process. It's not really much more involved than that.
As long as you have a streamlined process, it makes your life easier and makes everyone else's life easier. I completely understand that. Do you have a memorable story or experience that influenced your songwriting?
So that's another very good question. All of the songs that I write are about a situation, a set of circumstances, normally involving two people in some sort of romantic relationship. And all of those songs are based on observation or based on. I don't tend to write from my own experiences because that can be a very difficult thing to do, of course, on the one hand. And on the other hand, that doesn't always turn out that well. And you end up having to edit that quite a lot to make it into a good song. That sort of thing I find works better as, say, like a memoir or a biography or something. But I don't find that translates very well into music. So all of the songs that I write are based on observation of very simple scenes between two people.
Being in England, does the atmosphere, does the culture, does anything like that influence your style when it comes to your creativity?
Oh, well, I think everything that's going on around us has influences. We pick up on things, and that informs what we think and how we act to a large extent. I grew up learning music classically. I grew up learning the cello and the double bass, and I grew up playing in orchestras from a very young age. So I learned in a very formal, almost sort of academic way, which was great because, people were very supportive of that. And then when I left school, I started listening to other things because I'd just been listening to sort of classical music, and that had been the stuff that you were taught. That was the stuff, that was all the input you were getting, was kind of the great classical composers. When I left school and when I started at university, I started listening to other types of music, to different genres, and I listened to as much as I could of everything. What's great about the British music scene is that there is so much diversity within, what is comparably to somewhere like, even somewhere like Canada. It's the sort of quite a smaller scene, but there is, within that, there is a lot of opportunity to really listen to as many different genres of music from as many different sort of cultures as possible. And so I listened to everything. The first live music that I went to see after sort of operatic stuff was heavy metal. And that was the first live music I remember going to places, going to the bars and the clubs, and seeing metal bands, sort of very heavy metal bands. And you pick up a lot from that, and you can say, okay, that's, maybe I can use some of that in my music. But really, yes, there's a lot of cultural diversity within the UK, and which is a very positive thing because you pick up a lot of very good influences. But I guess the music that I settled on after that was folk. I listened to a lot of my parents' music. I listened to a lot of the sort of the great songwriters, Bob Dylan and Leonard Cohen and Joni Mitchell. These the really, really big sort of songwriters. That's the kind of stuff that I listen to most, I think.
When I was listening to your music, especially with Americana, I definitely heard Leonard Cohen, Joni Mitchell. I heard those influences in and Dylan as well. I heard those influences in your music because they're very iconic musicians in their own right, and the subtleties in what I picked up, especially with your chords and your transitions of your actual songs there that I got to listen to, I could hear those influences, and it sounded wonderful. It was like that feel-good moment where you basically embodied the key U.S. musicians of the era with your Americana album.
Thank you. I try very hard to not to emulate those people because there's no. I don't really think it's possible to recreate something like that. I think lyrically, I get a lot of my influences from those artists, and I did for a while sort of actually sit down and study those songwriters and study their songs and their sort of writing processes to see how, if I could recreate that, firstly, and then whether or not that was actually going to be able to inform what I was doing in any significant way.
When you were writing Americana, and this is something I kind of picked up on when I was listening to the music, were you doing like layered audio tracks when it came to the vocalization of it versus your instrumentals? Because I thought I heard an almost a call and response or an echo style when it was playing.
I understand. No, oh no, I understand. As far as the technical side goes, I don't get involved in that too much because there are people who are just more experienced and who are sort of more professional than I am with that these audio engineers and producers, even other musicians, they tend to be a lot more proficient at that than I am. So I don't like to get too involved. But I think, yes, one of the things that I wanted, one of the effects that I wanted to achieve was this kind of almost doubling the vocal lines in some of the songs. It's almost like an echo, kind of a very strong echo. In a lot of that echo effect, you hear a lot. You do hear that a lot, that echo effect in music, but I wanted to make that sort of more prominent in the songs on a few of them. So you kind of had this idea of almost like two tracks playing simultaneously. Yes, that was something I wanted to achieve on the album, and I think on some of those tracks it works quite well.
Yeah, no, it does. I didn't know if that was the theme you're going for with the Americana genre itself when it came to that style of folk music. If you wanted to influence the listener or make a point when it came to the particular songs and the titles you created for that album.
That was a conscious decision on that one. I'd listened to a lot of American folk music, especially a lot of the more contemporary kind of stuff where they are using a lot of effects and a lot of sort of distortion and reverb and things, a lot of very sort of electronic effects. They're bringing that sort of synthesized sound into folk music, which I think is very interesting and a very, very kind of interesting interpretation of that genre for a lot of these artists. And I think I was trying to do something similar.
Yeah. No, that's good. I think it's definitely a good approach to, especially the folk genre. A lot of people who may have heard your work, like, what has been the reaction to the Americana album as well as your other albums that you've created? How has that been for fans and in terms of interaction?
That's an interesting one because I did well, there were going to be three albums which were based on trying to tap into that American folk genre. As there were going to be three, and Americana was the second. First of those, which came out in 2023, that was received very well by listeners. It got a lot of sort of, if you're looking at streams and things like that, and airplay and that kind of thing, it was received very well by listeners, but not so well by the music press.
Oh.
The music press didn't really pick up on that one. But with Americana, it's kind of the other way. It's had less of an impact with listeners and more of an impact with music critics, which is interesting because I actually prefer my personal choice would be Americana. But the thing that's been picked up by listeners, by the public, and the thing that gets the response and the thing that gets the sort of the comments and that side of thing was the previous album, which is interesting. And it was, yeah, it's been well received. I hope with the next one, I'll be able to get both. The aim is to sort of to be able to hit it off with the critics and to get listeners sort of really sort of listening to it as well.
What was the first album that the fans reacted to, and what was the third one that you're currently creating?
First one, and that was the first album which I put out, that had a really good response from listeners. the first album that I did, which was really picked up by people, and that's called Keeping Some Kind of a Record. And that's 2023 that came out, and that was very well received by people. And it was, as I say, it was the first album which people picked up and said, "This is a good album," and one that I felt confident in, because I didn't have much of a fan base and I didn't have much of a presence in the media before that. And that was a relief in a sense, because it was, it felt like I was doing the right thing. Americana is we're still waiting for that one to get some traction with listeners. The next one, which is coming out this summer, is called Wintergarten. Wintergarten was the name of the road that I lived on in the south of Sweden, which is where I wrote the album. And I was listening to a lot of folk music from Scandinavia as part of the whole looking at American folk music. And then I was looking at obviously English folk music and sort of broadly sort of folk music from the Northern Hemisphere, I guess. I was living in a small town in the sort of on the south coast of Sweden, and the road I was living on was called Wintergarten. That album is again a very similar sort of ideas and things that are being dealt with in that album that were dealt with in Americana and Keeping Some Kind of a Record. It's that idea of observing people in a kind of people watching, but in a sort of a romantic context.
When it comes to folk music and the genre itself here, is there something that's generational, no matter where you are in the world, that people just gravitate towards this genre of music?
The wonderful thing about folk, that's another great question, but the wonderful thing about folk music, I think the thing that is so great about it, it's always based on people who have a very strong sense of place. Folk music is, I'm certainly English folk, it is based on this kind of, it's storytelling, but about local events and about, the local places and local events and local people, and sort of it's very much based on a region or a locality, and it does tap into people's connection to the environment in which they live or in which they grew up. And I think everyone can relate to that in some way, because especially if they've got that shared experience of having lived in the same area, everyone can sort of tap into that sense of history and that sense of place. And it's very important for people. Very, very important. National identity is obviously a hugely, hugely important thing. Well, it's a huge topic. It's a very big question, but obviously people's sense of identity is very important to them, and nationality plays a huge part in that. And folk music just gives another way of expressing that and exploring that, I think.
So have you found your own identity with your music?
That's again a great question, but a very big one. I try to treat what I do as a job. I know it's not in a conventional sense. It's if it is a kind of, I don't think it makes sense to create a job role around what musicians do. I don't really think it's such an individual thing, and every musician that I meet is so different and has such a different approach to what they're doing that I don't think it makes sense to sort of create a job role as such. I do try to treat what I do like work as much as possible. I try to have as professional an attitude towards it as I can, to try and give myself a sense of sort of social identity. And it is very important, I think, that people have that sense of being a part of wider society, and that they don't feel that they're in some way working, outside of wider society. And I think, yes, the way I understand music, or what I do with music, has that sort of social validity, which is important, again, which is a very important thing psychologically for people to to not feel too isolated from what's going on in society and to have that sort of social identity.
So then what's the difference between you playing in a studio and playing at a live event? What is that for you as a creative person?
Oh, there's less people. The first thing is there's you don't you don't this it sounds very simple to say, but if you're in a studio, unless you're working with an orchestra, if you're working in a recording studio, you're working with maybe a producer, maybe a sound engineer, well, five or four or five other musicians, say. And that's firstly that's a smaller, that's a more that's a tighter knit group of people for a start. And you're also in the process of creating something. You're recording an album that has its own sort of, there's methods for doing that. There's ways of doing that. There's a way to record onto a mixing desk. There's a way to produce an album. And that kind of has its own, so it's kind of easier in a way because you don't have to concentrate too much on what you're doing. If you can just sort of get on with it and do it and finish the album and that's it. So in a way, that's quite easy. In front of a live audience, where you have the audience, so you have a sense of uncertainty because you cannot preempt how people are going to react to what you're doing. So there is a sense of uncertainty there. But at the same time, if you get the right reception from the audience, and if the audience are enjoying themselves, and if the audience are really interested in what you're doing and what you're doing up there on stage, it does give you a very good feeling. It does give you a very good feeling because you're getting a lot of people who are enjoying themselves, which is a great thing, and you do get the sense that you're doing something which is genuinely worthwhile, which is nice.
How do you find your unique voice when it comes to the saturation of the music landscape?
I'll give you an example, a very good example of this, and it's the Bob Dylan film, which has just come out with Timothy Chalamet. And before the film was released, Dylan went himself to the director and read from the script all of the Bob Dylan lines and had the director read back all of the other lines to him. And that demonstrates that Bob Dylan is Bob Dylan and that he is able to inhabit his own voice. He is able to be himself, and only he is able to be himself. I think that's the most important thing, is that you speak with your own voice and that you don't try too hard to imitate or emulate other people. Once you're comfortable with that, that's very easy to do. People find that very difficult to find a voice, but it's just what you're most natural doing, the most natural thing in the world. Once you're comfortable with yourself and once you've, have a little bit of experience and, you get the right people around you, it's a very, very easy and a very natural thing to do, but very, very important, because it is very, very important that I'd say in any, not just in music, in life in general, any walk of life, I would suggest that speaking with your own voice and being yourself and owning your own identity is a very important thing.
What's a lesson you learned from your parents that shaped your musical journey?
The thing that I picked up from my parents, both my parents, and I'm incredibly grateful for, is obviously their support, which is invaluable, and also their taste in music. I developed a lot of my taste in music from their taste. I inherited a lot of that taste, and that was Bob Dylan, Leonard Cohen, Joni Mitchell, Cat Stevens, Gil Scott-Heron, all of those musicians. And I inherited really a lot of that from my parents. That was the first sort of music that I listened to after classical. And so I owe them quite a lot when it comes to my taste in music, because I wouldn't have done that otherwise. I don't think I would never have listened to someone like Dylan unless my parents had played it to me.
Was it we're forcing this on you? You listen to this type deal? It wasn't like that. It was just like playing it in the car or playing it at home or things like that, and you just kind of gravitated towards it.
It was never because my background was, as I say, in classical, then I started getting interested in what they were listening to. And it wasn't as if they would sit me down and say, right, you've got to listen to Big Yellow Taxi or whatever. They would just be listening to music. It would be on in the background. And I would start listening to that and start sort of tuning into that, if you like, rather than the classical stuff. So it very much was, I think, without them knowing. And then suddenly I would start saying, oh, tell me more about this, tell me more about this. And then started sort of endlessly sort of annoying them with questions about, their musical taste. Yes, I think it was, no, but that was very much something that I gravitated towards naturally, I think.
What is the second wisest piece of advice you've received that has stuck with you in your career?
That there's lots of people out there who are keen to give you advice on what you're doing, because music is such a personal thing and sort of creates such strong feelings in people, that there are a lot of people out there who are happy to offer their opinion, and that can be a very enlightening experience sometimes. The thing that stuck with me, the piece of advice that has stuck with me the most, was I was working with a producer called Phil Leppanen, who was in a punk band in the 80s, and he works out of a recording studio in central London, near London Bridge. And it was the first time I had recorded anything. And it was the first time I'd had a song, and I said, right, well, I've got these songs, and I want to record them. I want to put them on record. I had all these questions, and I had all this anxiety, and I had all this sort of trepidation over how that was going to pan out, and what he was going to do with the songs, and how they were going to sound. And there's this lot of kind of, but mainly because I didn't have the experience at that point, there was a lot of sort of uncertainty there over what I was doing, basically, what I was going to do with these songs. And Vil, he said to me, just record the music. That's all you have to do. Just come into the studio, sit down, play the guitar, and sing the songs. And that's all you have to do. And that was probably the best advice that I've had so far about recording music. That would be the thing I would tell people, is not to worry about what else is going on around you. Whatever else is going on around you, don't worry about it. Just focus on getting the music out, and all the rest will come after that.
Everyone has one person that inspired them on their path to where they are today. Who was that for you?
There are so many people who I could name as inspiration. I think I have to say, and I do feel I should say, when I wanted to learn the drums for a very long time. I'd played the cello, I played the bass, I taught myself guitar, I taught myself piano. I had a very good piano teacher, but I wanted to learn drums because I wanted to be able to write a piece of music for all the musicians. And I wanted to be able to do that. I wanted to understand how all those instruments worked and how those instruments worked together. One of the things I really wanted to do was learn to play drums. And I found this fantastic drum teacher called Camille Phillips, who is also based in Brighton, I think. And she plays with a band called the Subways, who are a sort of indie rock band. Again, they're from the UK. But she was a quite fantastic teacher. And she showed me, well, as much drums as she could. That really, really helped me to understand music in a more comprehensive way, and to to compose some of those albums. So if yes, I would say that Camille probably is one of the most influential.
From a professional standpoint, you have created 2 amazing albums. You're working on your 3rd, which I can't wait to see, and it has garnered both fan and critic acclaim. So from a professional standpoint, you are successful. Do you consider yourself personally successful?
I think it's important to do as you have done just there and separate the personal from the professional, because they are obviously two different things. Obviously, a creative vocation does require you to put some of yourself into your work. If you put too much of yourself into your work, then it becomes exhausting on the one hand. And if it goes badly, then you take that criticism onto yourself. And that's actually quite an easy thing. It's easy to take things personally, especially if you're putting some of yourself into your work. So I think you do have to separate those two things for a start. For me, on a very personal level, I'm well. I'm in good health. I have some great friends. I have a very supportive family. I'm able to do something which I enjoy for a living, and so I wouldn't wish to complain about any of about any of those things on a personal level. It would be it would just sound a little, I think, a little ungrateful if I were to complain too much about my own sort of situation.
The reverse of success is failure. How do you deal with your failures?
You see, failure is failure and success is success. Failure is not success. So, and the two things, unfortunately, are not compatible. As I think, as much as anyone will tell you that, you can learn from failure and you can turn them into successes and you can do that. I don't think that's a particularly good way to think. I think it's more important that if something hasn't gone well, and it doesn't matter what it is, if something hasn't gone well or something hasn't gone the way you wanted, I think it's important to recognize that and then to move on. And then to move on to whatever you're doing next, rather than dwell on that particular event. And I think it's the same with success. If you've done what, say, if you do one good song or one good album or one half decent album or one song which went well or one album which was well received or a show which got particularly good reviews, I think it's best not to rest on that. I think it's best to recognize the achievement and be proud of that, but then again to move on. So, you keep that momentum going rather than sort of dwelling on any success or failure.
The younger generation is looking at your work and then becoming inspired to be creative in their own way, whether it's as a musician, a songwriter, some way, creative shape or form, maybe you're inspiring them down that path. How can they inspire the generation that follows them?
That is one of the most difficult things to do with music, is to find a way of reaching different generations, because obviously your peer group is how you define yourself. Your friends are part of how you define yourself, and they're all of the same generation, or they all tend to be of the same generation. The music that they listen to, the genre, the clothes, the everything, how people define themselves and have a sense of identity as individuals and within a friendship sort of group, that is so tied into their generation that if you come from a different generation, it can be very, very difficult to get something through to them without immediately being sort of ignored because you're a different generation. I think it's very, very important to try and find a common reference, something which you have a shared interest in. And I think some things do cross generational boundaries. There are a lot of music being one of them. It's a major one which crosses generational boundaries. These musicians that have had 40, 50-year careers, they are influencing people of a number of generations. And I think as long as you can find some common ground somewhere, then you are able to get your point across to a different generation, and hopefully for them to be inspired and pick up on that themselves and use that in their own lives. So I would say find some common ground, and then that's a good place to start. And music is a very good example of common ground.
Last question is this before we wrap up and ask where we can find you, how we can support you online, and it is this. If your life was a musical, what would its title be, and what would its soundtrack be?
I've never been asked anything like that. So that is a really, really good, very, very well thought out questions. The musical would probably be, I would hope it would be a massive Broadway show with choruses and dancers and animals and cannons, and hopefully it would be quite a spectacle. But it would probably be something like "Let Music Be Your Guide." The title would be something like that, and it would yes, that was something like that, something like "Let Music Be Your Guide," and it would be kind of hopefully starring someone like Timothy Chalamet. But yes, it would be it would be very much how music is helping people on their own particular paths in life.
Good stuff. Well, I do hate to say it, but that ends this particular interview on Two Geeks Talking. William, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show.
Again, thank you very much for those great questions, Kurt. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Appreciate that. Where can we find you? How can we support you? And anything else you would like to promote?
The best place to find me would be at a show. The best place to find me would be at a live performance. If you are in the UK and you are listening, I'll be playing at the Focus Wales Festival, which is in May this year. And if you are listening from the UK, it would be fantastic to see some of you there. If you're more of a digitally minded person, then the website, williamjohntitusbishop.com, is where you can find all the information that you possibly want on myself and my music. And of course, whichever social media platform you are most comfortable using, I will have a page on one of those as well. So I'm not that hard to find. If you do want to find any information on my music or tour dates or anything like that, it's there's a lot there for people to get stuck into if they wish.
Well, like I said, that ends this particular episode of Two Geeks Talk. You can, of course, find this interview and 1,200 plus others on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/TGT Media. That's Two Geeks Talking, TWO. The podcast you can find wherever you get your podcast by searching Two Geeks Talking, or just go to twogeekstalking.podbean.com. And as I say every week, everyone has a story to tell. It's up to me to help bring that out. Thanks for listening and watching on Two Geeks Talking.